Hello, I'm Jackie Fox, and welcome to Fox Talks. I learned something new this week. Francis Scott Key was a racist, and there's a reason we only sing 1/4 of the national anthem. So apparently there was a controversy about the national anthem that ran concurrent to the whole snowflake meltdown that happened in response to Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during the national anthem, that was saying that the national anthem itself was racist. Well, is it? I've already hinted to you the answer to this, by the way. The Star Spangled Banner that we're taught in school to memorize, as we're all but forced to recite it, there's nothing racist about that, is there? Sure, maybe not that part, but that's only 1/4 of Francis Scott Key's full work. The part we omit has a lot to do with the kind of person that Francis Scott Key was, a topic I'll touch on in a minute. This is the third of the 4 verses, and the one in question. But I'd like to bring your attention to a particular part. A home and a country should leave us no more. Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. Francis Scott Key is a skilled poet. I have to credit him that. If you sit down and really reflect on the first verse, its use of imagery, it paints a powerful picture across your imagination. But so does this scene. And frankly, it's not a picture that Americans would be happy hanging on their walls beside this great work of art. In a piece in The Nation on the verse, Jeffrey Robinson wrote, "The third verse, Key had a special message for the enslaved people who had dared to fight up for their freedom. We will pursue you to get revenge. His message to the blacks fighting for freedom was unmistakable. We will hunt you down, and the search will leave you in terror because, when we find you, your next stop is the gloom of the grave." Some people try to claim that he was writing about some other group of slaves, but there is no historical evidence that the word slave ever referred to anyone other than black enslaved people, whom Key viewed as a distinct and inferior race of people, which experience proves to be the greatest evil that affects the community. Francis Scott Key was one of the richest men in America, born to massive slaveholding wealth in Maryland. He's one of few men in history whose fight to defend the American right to own their fellow man, woman, and child as slaves continued even on after he died. The U.S. Supreme Court, which he helped shape, stood strongly for slavery. Other than him writing the Star Spangled Banner, which was only elevated as the national anthem after his death, his legacy and his life purpose can be summed up in 2 words: defending slavery. We have to remember who the man was and what his positions were when we consider the works of art that he created, because, in some way, that is the world his words intend to invoke in our minds. No refuge could save the hireling or slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. What exactly was meant by that, and how much malice is hidden in Old English and poetic tongue? Let's set the scene. Quoting Christopher Wilson of Smithsonian.com, on September 13, 1814, British warships commenced an attack on Fort McHenry, which defended the city's harbor. For 25 hours, bombs and rockets rained down on the fort, while Americans, still wondering whether their newfound freedom would really be so short-lived, awaited news of Baltimore's fate. Key, stuck aboard a British ship where he had been negotiating a prisoner release, and barred by the officers of the HMS Tonnant from leaving because he knew too much about their position, could only watch the battle and hope for the best. By the dawn's early light of the next day, Key saw the huge garrison flag, now on view at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, waving above Fort McHenry, and he realized that the Americans had survived the battle and stopped the enemy advance. The poem he wrote celebrated the Star Spangled Banner as a symbol of resilience and triumph of the United States. Though, ironically, while Key was composing the line over the land of the free, it is likely that black slaves were trying to reach the British ships in Baltimore Harbor like the one he was in. They knew that they were far more likely to find freedom and liberty under a Union Jack than they ever were under the Star Spangled Banner. So there he was, aboard a British ship, looking out into the turbulent waters, and he sees slaves running towards his boat, many of them dying in the crossfire as they charge British ships hoping to escape their American lives as slaves. And remembering that the image of men being cut down by bombs, only wanting to be free, like he was, he wrote, "No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave." In those words, this was the image that he was trying to convey. Black people were dying for their freedom in front of him, and still he saw them as a lesser being, even though he, at the time, wanted so desperately for his people to be free. A home and a country should leave us no more. Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. And yet, the more I learn about his life outside of this moment, the more I think that he would have been able to have ended this verse with, "And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the slave," and truly not seen the painful irony that statement was. Another admittedly pretty metal line sticks out for me as well here. Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. What a bitter way to describe his hatred for the British, who he didn't think deserved to be in a country he thought of as belonging to him and his people. But he also didn't believe that Africans belonged in America either, just like the British. You see, Francis Scott Key was a farm owner and a lawyer, but also a slave owner, who purchased his first slave by 1801 and owned 6 slaves by 1820. Mostly in the 1930s, Key set free 7 slaves, keeping one on to work for him for wages as his farm's foreman, supervising several other slaves. Throughout his career, Key also represented several slaves seeking their freedom in court, as well as several masters seeking the return of their runaway slaves. Key, Judge William Lee, and Bishop William Meade were administrators of the will of their friend, John Randolph, who died without children and left a will directing his executors to free his more than 400 slaves. So over the course of his career, he freed hundreds of slaves in the courts, as well as 7 of his own. He's not racist, right? He's just doing as people did at the time. See? He's a really a good guy. You know, it was the times that were bad. Well, you're wrong. Though he may have fought to free some slaves, he still owned many more. He purchased his first slave between 13 and 14 years after seeing the slaves he referenced. He purchased his first slave 14 years before seeing the slaves he referenced running for safety to the English ship, before being blasted apart. And yet, when he got off that boat, and even after writing about the land of the free, he continued to own them. He didn't set free the ones that he still felt like he needed for labor on his farm. He still believed it was worth it to deny them their freedom. Seeing them run into the bombs, fired from the ships that he was waiting on, being blown apart in front of him, only wanting to be free. Somehow this wasn't enough to convince him of their right, that the same freedom as people he thought belonged in America. Like the British, he believed that black people had no right to freedom in America. In some way, the blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. The line before the reference to slave also applies to them too. He truly believed that they didn't belong in America to begin with. Key was a founding member and an active leader in the American Colonialization Society and its predecessor, the influential Maryland branch, the primary goal of which was to send free African Americans back to Africa. He left the group in 1933 when their goal shifted to the abolition of slavery altogether, a goal that did not align with his own, because like his friend, John Randolph, he intended to die owning slaves. President Jackson, who himself was a wealthy slave owner, nominated Key for United States Attorney for the District of Columbia in 1833. After the U.S. Senate approved the nomination, he served for 8 years, during which he used his position as a U.S. Attorney to suppress abolitionists. Even in his first year, he secured a grand jury indictment against Benjamin Lundy, editor of the anti-slavery publication The Genius of Universal Emancipation, and his partner, William Greer, for libel, after Lundy published an article that declared, quote, "There is no mercy nor justice for colored people in the District of Columbia." Lundy's article, Key said in the indictment, was intended to injure, oppress, aggrieve, and vilify the good name, fame, credit, and reputation of the magistrates and constables of Washington. In his final address to the jury, he said, "Are you willing, gentlemen, to abandon your country, to permit it to be taken from you, and occupied by the abolitionist, according to whose taste it is to associate and amalgamate with the Negro? Or, gentlemen, on the other hand, are there laws in this community to defend you from the immediate abolitionist, who would open upon you the floodgates of such extensive wickedness and mischief?" Key felt that the abolitionists' free speech rights were so dangerous that he sought, unsuccessfully, to have Crandall hanged. It seems that much of his fervor came from the fact that Key not only profited from slaves, he harbored racist conceptions of American citizenship and human potential. Africans in America, he said, were, and I quote this again directly, "a distinct and inferior race of people, which all experience proves to be the greatest evil that afflicts a community." He died only 6 years after Crandall was acquitted, 2 years after leaving office. And as I alluded to before, his racism outlived him. He was the brother-in-law of Roger B. Taney, and helped him secure the position of Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. 14 years after Key's death, a now ancient Taney authored perhaps the most pitiless Supreme Court decision ever, named for Dred Scott. Taney declared that black people, free or enslaved, were utterly meaningless in the eyes of the law and could never be citizens. This was a position that Key seemed to die supporting. If he had been alive, he might have even cheered for his brother-in-law on the Supreme Court seat that he had secured for him. In my mind, I keep coming back to the words, "No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight, the gloom of the grave." And I keep seeing the images of slaves running into explosions, being blown to bits, running for ships that they likely couldn't even swim to, and they were unlikely to be accepted by them if they could, each risking their lives for what we think of as a right, freedom. And if he couldn't see that they were humans with lives just like him, after seeing that moment in history, it's no wonder that he died in the support of an idea like that black people, free or enslaved, were utterly meaningless in the eyes of the law and could never be citizens because they were a distinct and inferior race of people, which all experience proves to be the greatest evil that affects a community. So, in summation, fuck Francis Scott Key. I don't expect you to believe that there's anything wrong with the first verse of the Star Spangled Banner or our national anthem. Not at all. In isolation, in spite of his ambitions to silence the abolitionist movement by killing them in direct violation of their First Amendment rights if he had to, abolitionism worked. Despite his hatred, the Star Spangled Banner now hangs over a land where, against his dying breath, slavery is illegal. And we finally have the land of the free that he spoke of. At least mostly. I hope he's rolling in his grave every time it's played. But I also want you to remember the imagery. And that includes the scene that wasn't able to convince him that, African though they were, they longed to be free Americans every bit as much as he did. And if you take a seat early, or take your hand off your heart as you begin to imagine these men running into a curtain of bombs, into near certain death because it was better to have hope than a short life of being worked to death as a slave, I won't blame you. It's your freedom of speech, not to recite the National Anthem. It's your freedom of expression, not to stand, cover your heart, or even to kneel. And if anyone asks you why you're doing it, tell them the truth about the scene playing out in your head, and how the writer of this song saw that and continued to fight for slavery until his death. I really didn't expect to go down this rabbit hole today. But this is what happens sometimes when you look into what people believe and you ask what the truth is. And that's something that we all need to start doing for ourselves a lot more often. And I'm perfectly happy to do it for you. But I'm also going to include my sources like I always do, so that you can see for yourself and you can read the parts of these articles that I didn't read for you. If you think that I'm maybe cherry picking, or that maybe that wasn't as bad as I made it out to be, feel free to read for yourself, to use those as starting points, to look at their sources, to pick phrases out and Google them to see what other sides are saying about this. Be inquisitive and look for the truth. But also know that I wouldn't have made this video if I didn't think that I was at least mostly right. And if you appreciate me doing this, give me a like, subscribe, hit me up on Patreon. However you want to support this channel is fine by me. And if you have any ideas about other things that you would like to see me look into and try to get to the truth of for you, drop them down in the comments. I'd be happy to reply to a couple of your suggestions. So, I hope you have a deeper understanding now of what this song means and what it was written to mean. And why things might not always be as obvious as they seem. And why it pays to look into your own beliefs. Even if it was something that you were absolutely raised to believe, or maybe we could even call it indoctrination. Just look for the truth for yourselves. That's all I'm saying. That and fuck Francis Scott Key.